Let me tell you exactly what happened 3 days ago in Jerusalem. A former Prime Minister of Israel, a man who once sat in the most secure room in the Middle East, who had access to every intelligence file, every satellite image, every contingency plan, stood up in front of a room full of American Jewish leaders and said something that I don't think the mainstream media has fully processed yet. He didn't say Iran. He didn't say Hamas. He didn't say Hezbollah. He said Turkey. Naftali Bennett looked into that room and declared that Turkey is, quote, a sophisticated and dangerous adversary who wants to surround Israel, and that Israel must not, quote, turn a blind eye again. Again. That word matters. We'll come back to it. Within hours of Bennett saying those words, a commentator at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, one of the most influential pro-Israel think tanks in this country, went on record and warned Turkey that it, quote, should not rely on its NATO membership for protection. Let that land for a second. A NATO ally, a country that has been a member of the same military alliance as the United States since 1952. A country with the second largest standing army in NATO, a country that controls the only naval passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. That country is being told publicly by voices in Washington that its NATO membership might not protect it. If you've been following the Middle East since 1979, and I know most of you watching this have, you know that when Israel starts naming its next threat out loud, something is already in motion. You don't make that kind of declaration in front of that kind of audience without a reason. You don't issue that kind of warning from Washington think tanks without coordination. So today, we are going to do what this channel does. We're going to go past the headline, past the soundbite, past the hot take, and we're going to break down exactly what is happening, why it's happening right now, and what it means for every American who understands that when Israel moves, the United States eventually gets pulled in. Because here's the thing nobody is saying clearly enough. A conflict between Israel and Turkey would not be Gaza. It would not be Lebanon. It would not even be Iran. It would be something this region and this alliance has never seen before. And the United States would be caught in the middle in a way that has no clean exit. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand this situation in a way that most people in Washington apparently do not. And you're going to understand why what happens next in Syria, not Iran, not Gaza, not the West Bank, Syria, could be the spark that changes everything. Let's start at the beginning. February 2026, Jerusalem, the Conference of Presidents of major American Jewish organizations. This is not a fringe gathering. This is one of the most significant forums in American Jewish political life. When Israeli politicians speak here, they are speaking directly to the most organized, most politically connected, most financially influential Jewish community in the world. They are speaking to donors, to lobbyists, to people who have the phone numbers of United States senators saved in their contacts. Naftali Bennett chose this room to deliver this message. Turkey, he said, is building a new axis, an axis that links Ankara to Qatar, to the Muslim Brotherhood, and, here is the part that made the room go quiet, to Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state. Bennett was not describing a trade dispute or a diplomatic rivalry. He was describing what he called an encirclement strategy, a ring being drawn around Israel by a coalition he called similar to the Iranian one, but potentially more dangerous than Iran. Think about what that means coming from a former Israeli prime minister who spent years dealing with Iranian proxies, Iranian missiles, Iranian funding for Hamas and Hezbollah. He said Turkey could be worse. Now, before we go any further, I want to give you something that most analysis of this story leaves out entirely, because there are actually two ways to read what Bennett said, and both of them are important. The first reading is the strategic one, that Bennett genuinely believes Turkey represents a rising threat, that the evidence on the ground in Syria supports that assessment, and that he is doing what responsible former leaders do, raising the alarm before it's too late. We're going to examine that evidence in detail, and I'll tell you right now, some of it is serious. Some of it deserves your attention. The second reading comes from a former Israeli ambassador named Alon Pinkas, a man who spent years representing Israel in Washington, and who knows exactly how this game is played. And Pincus said something that I think every American watching this needs to hear. His words, not mine. Politicians like Bennett and Netanyahu rely on the perpetual threat of war. If it wasn't Turkey, it would be Iraq. There just always needs to be a threat. There just always needs to be a threat. Now, I'm not saying Bennett is lying. I'm not saying the threat is manufactured. What I'm saying is that you need to hold both of those readings in your head at the same time as we go through this. Because the truth, as is always the case in the Middle East, is somewhere in the complicated middle. Here's what we know for certain. Israel and Turkey were once not just coexisting. They were close. Military cooperation, intelligence sharing, trade partnerships. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, these two countries had one of the most functional relationships in the entire region. Israeli tourists flooded Turkey's beaches. Turkish companies built Israeli infrastructure. The two militaries trained together. That relationship did not slowly drift apart. It shattered. And it shattered on a specific date, with a specific event, that you may remember if you were paying attention to international news in 2010. May 31st, 2010. The Mavi Marmara, a Gaza-bound flotilla, Israeli commandos, a raid that went wrong in ways nobody had planned for. 10 Turkish activists killed. Erdogan called it, and I'm quoting directly, an act of state terrorism. He expelled the Israeli ambassador. He began a years-long process of political distancing that is never fully reversed. But here's what most people don't realize. Even after 2010, even through years of tension and rhetoric, Turkey and Israel kept trading, kept doing business. The relationship was damaged, but the economic ties held. Until May 2024. Turkey imposed a complete trade embargo on Israel. Everything, imports, exports, all of it. Billions of dollars in economic activity, gone, overnight. And that embargo is still in place today. Now ask yourself, why does that timeline matter? Because it means that by the time Assad fell in December 2024, Israel and Turkey had already spent 6 months in a state of economic warfare. They were not entering the Syrian power vacuum as neutral competitors. They were entering it as adversaries who had already drawn economic blood. And that, right there, is where this story gets genuinely dangerous. When Assad fell in December 2024, something happened that nobody in Washington had fully wargamed. Two of America's most important regional partners, Israel and Turkey, both moved into Syrian territory, simultaneously, aggressively, and they started competing for the exact same strategic space. Think about what that means geographically. Syria shares a border with Israel to the southwest. Turkey controls the north through its proxy forces. The new government in Damascus is weak, dependent on outside support, and trying to play both sides. And in the middle, in the center of Syria, in places like Homs, like Hama, you have both Israeli and Turkish interests converging on the same airfields, the same military positions, the same real estate. Israel has conducted dozens of airstrikes inside Syria since December 2024. Dozens. And Israel has ground forces in southern Syria with no stated withdrawal timeline. Netanyahu has said publicly, not privately, publicly, that Turkey will not be allowed to establish military bases in Syria that could threaten Israel. Turkey, for its part, has been negotiating with the new Damascus government for permanent military bases. And when Turkish planners began scouting base locations at the Homs airport, at the Hama air base, Israel didn't issue a diplomatic protest. Israel didn't call an emergency UN session. Israel bombed those exact sites. Let me say that again. Turkey identified military positions it wanted. Israel destroyed them from the air, in another country's territory, without asking anyone's permission. A senior Turkish presidential advisor responded with language that, according to diplomatic sources who were in the room, shocked everyone who heard it. Not measured diplomatic language, not the usual carefully calibrated response. Personal, direct, threatening. The kind of language that signals the speaker is no longer operating on the assumption that certain lines won't be crossed. And then a Turkish analyst named Yasiltis said something in public that I want you to think about carefully. He said, if Tel Aviv persists on this path, a conflict between Ankara and Tel Aviv will become inevitable. Inevitable. Not possible. Not concerning. Inevitable. Now here's the question that I know you're asking, because it's the right question. It's the question that matters. Is this real, or is this posturing? Is this two regional powers doing the diplomatic equivalent of chest bumping, knowing full well neither one is going to actually throw a punch? Because we've seen that movie before in the Middle East, many times. The honest answer, and I'm going to give you the honest answer, not the dramatic one, is probably the latter. Probably. But here's why probably is not as reassuring as it used to be. And here's why the Syria situation is the one variable that could change the calculation in ways nobody is prepared for. Because in Syria, unlike Iran, unlike Gaza, unlike Lebanon, the forces are physically close enough to each other that an accident is possible. A drone goes off course. A strike hits the wrong target. A commander in the field makes a decision that his superiors didn't authorize. These things happen in war zones. They have happened throughout history. And when they happen between two countries that are already in a state of heightened tension, with both sides having made public statements about what they will and will not tolerate, they can escalate in ways that nobody intended and nobody wanted. The Syria flashpoint is not about whether Bennett means what he says or whether Erdogan is bluffing. The Syria flashpoint is about whether the physical proximity of two well-armed, highly motivated, deeply suspicious forces in an ungoverned space can be managed indefinitely without an incident. History says no. History says it cannot. So what happens when it doesn't? I want you to think about a specific scenario. And I want you to think about it not as a hypothetical, but as a genuine contingency planning exercise. Because I promise you, there are people in the Pentagon right now who are doing exactly this. Israel strikes Turkish forces or Turkish-backed positions inside Syria. Maybe it's intentional. Maybe it's the accident I just described. Either way, Turkish soldiers are dead. Turkish military assets are destroyed by Israel. Turkey invokes Article 5. For anyone who needs a quick refresher, Article 5 of the NATO treaty is the Collective Defense Clause. An attack on one member is an attack on all. It's the foundational commitment that has held the alliance together for 75 years. It's the clause that was invoked for the first and only time in NATO's history after September 11, 2001, when our allies came to our defense. If Turkey invokes Article 5 after an Israeli strike, the United States, legally treaty-bound, could be obligated to defend Turkey against Israel. That has never happened in NATO's 75-year history, not once. No NATO member has ever been attacked by a country receiving active American military support. The scenario has no precedent. There is no playbook. There is no established diplomatic protocol. There is no answer in the NATO charter for what happens when your closest Middle East ally attacks your oldest Middle East NATO partner. The Trump administration's instinct, and this is not a guess, this is based on every public statement and every policy decision this administration has made, is to side with Israel. Full stop. No daylight between Washington and Tel Aviv. But here's what that choice would actually cost. If the United States sides with Israel in a conflict where Turkey has invoked Article 5, NATO's collective defense guarantee, the commitment that has deterred Russian aggression for 3/4 of a century, the commitment that every Eastern European country is counting on right now as Russian forces press against Ukraine. That guarantee becomes worthless. Every NATO member will know, from that point forward, that Article 5 only applies when Washington decides it applies, that it can be overridden by American political preferences, that it is not a treaty commitment, it is a suggestion. Putin will know it. Xi will know it. Every adversary of every NATO member will know it. And Turkey? Turkey has options. Turkey has been flirting with Russia. Turkey has been buying Russian S-400 missiles. Turkey has been positioning itself as a bridge between NATO and Moscow in ways that have frustrated Washington for years. If the United States openly abandons Turkey in a conflict where Turkey invoked Article 5, the argument for Turkey remaining in NATO becomes very difficult to make. And a Turkey that exits NATO, or worse, a Turkey that pivots toward Russia or China, is a Turkey that closes the Bosphorus to NATO naval operations whenever it chooses. That strait, that narrow passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It is not a geographic detail. It is a strategic choke point that determines whether the United States Navy can operate effectively in two seas simultaneously. Control of the Bosphorus is why Turkey matters to NATO in a way that goes beyond troops and tanks and GDP. There is no clean option here. There is no choice Washington can make that doesn't cost something significant. And now let me tell you something else. Something that happened just a few months ago that most people have already forgotten, but that established a precedent that matters enormously for what we're discussing today. In September 2025, Israel bombed Qatar. Qatar, the country that hosts Al Udeid Air Base, the largest American air base in the entire Middle East region. The country that was, at that time, serving as a mediator in ceasefire negotiations that the United States was actively invested in. Israel bombed it. And Trump forced Netanyahu to personally apologize. Think about that. This administration, the most openly pro-Israel administration in American history, drew a line. When Israel crossed an American red line, even this president said, "No, you went too far. You apologize." That precedent is set. And it tells you something important about the limits of American support for Israeli military action. Those limits exist, even now, even with this administration. They exist. Now let's talk military, because I think there's a tendency in American media coverage of Israel's military operations, particularly among audiences who watch the Gulf War, who watch Desert Storm, who watched the speed with which Israeli air power dismantled Iran's air defenses last year, to assume that the Israeli military can do to any adversary what it did to the last one. That assumption is wrong when it comes to Turkey. And I want to explain exactly why, because the specifics matter. Iran, at the time of last year's exchange, had an air force that was flying aircraft from the 1970s. American aircraft that we sold to the Shah that had received 40-plus years of degraded maintenance under sanctions, that couldn't get spare parts, that couldn't get software updates. Iran's air defense systems were outdated, poorly integrated, and deeply vulnerable to electronic warfare. The Iranian economy, after decades of sanctions, could not sustain a prolonged conflict with a technologically superior adversary. Turkey is not Iran. Turkey is a G20 economy with a defense budget that has been growing every year for the past decade. Turkey produces its own domestically manufactured combat drones, the Bayraktar series, that have been combat-proven in Libya, in Syria, in Nagorno-Karabakh, and in Ukraine. The world has watched Turkish drone technology perform in real combat against real adversaries. It is not theoretical capability. It is documented battlefield performance. Turkey has F-16s, upgraded F-16s with modern avionics maintained to NATO standards, operated by NATO-trained pilots. Turkey has been in active combat operations in Syria and Iraq for years, which means its military is not a garrison force. It is a combat-experienced force. And then there are the S-400s, Russia's most advanced surface-to-air missile system, which Turkey purchased over American objections, and which prompted the United States to remove Turkey from the F-35 program. The S-400, combined with Turkey's domestically produced air defense systems, creates a layered defensive environment that is categorically different from anything Israel has previously faced. There is a doctrine in Israeli military and political thinking called the Begin Doctrine, named after Menachem Begin, who ordered the destruction of Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor in 1981. The doctrine authorizes preemptive military strikes to prevent existential threats to Israel's survival. It was the justification for striking Iraq in 1981. It was the justification for striking Syria's Al-Kibar reactor in 2007. It was applied, in modified form, to the conflict with Iran. But here's what the Begin Doctrine requires. The target has to represent an existential threat, a threat to Israel's survival as a state. That bar has never been applied to Turkey. Turkey has never called for Israel's destruction. Turkey has never denied Israel's right to exist. Turkey, whatever its current hostility, is not building a nuclear weapon aimed at Tel Aviv. By the criteria of its own doctrine, Israel has no legal or strategic framework for a preemptive military strike on Turkey. And without that framework, the domestic political support inside Israel for such an operation simply does not exist. But here's what I really want you to understand. Even setting aside doctrine, even setting aside military capability, even setting aside the NATO problem, there is one constraint on Israeli military action against Turkey that overrides everything else: the United States. Israel's entire military operational model depends on American support. Not just moral support, not just diplomatic support at the UN, resupply, ammunition, precision-guided munitions, intelligence sharing, the kind of battlefield logistics support that keeps a sustained air campaign running beyond the first few days. Israel does not have the independent logistical depth to wage a prolonged military campaign against a NATO-sized military without American backing. And the United States will not back a military campaign against a NATO member. Full stop. Not this administration, not any administration, because doing so would end NATO. And ending NATO would expose Europe to Russian aggression in ways that would create a crisis orders of magnitude larger than anything happening between Israel and Turkey. So, no strike is coming, almost certainly. The military math doesn't work, the doctrine doesn't apply, the Americans won't allow it, and both sides know it. So then what is this really about? Part 5, the real game, what Bennett and Netanyahu are actually doing. Here's where I'm going to ask you to think like a strategist rather than a news consumer. Because the most important question is not what Bennett said, it's why he said it. And it's why he said it now. Let's start with the domestic Israeli angle, because it's real and it matters. Netanyahu faces elections. Bennett wants to run against Netanyahu. In Israeli politics, just as in American politics, there is almost no issue more reliable for generating votes than national security. Specifically, the sense that there is a threat, that the current leadership is not taking it seriously enough, and that the challenger is the one who will take it seriously. Bennett's declaration that Turkey is the new Iran is not just foreign policy analysis. It is a campaign speech. It is positioning. He is telling Israeli voters, I see the threat that Netanyahu is ignoring. I will be tougher. I will be clearer-eyed. Vote for me. That is not a cynical observation. That is how democratic politics works. Everywhere, including here in the United States. I'm not condemning it. I'm contextualizing it. But here's what's important. The domestic political motivation doesn't make the underlying tension fake. It just means you need to separate the genuine strategic question from the electoral amplification of it. The genuine strategic question is this. With Iran's axis of resistance effectively shattered, Hamas weakened, Hezbollah decimated, Assad gone, Iran itself badly degraded by last year's exchange, Israel's traditional threat architecture has a vacancy at the top. And Israel's security establishment, its political class, its military planners, they are not in the business of operating without a defined primary threat. They never have been. They don't know how. Turkey is filling that vacancy, whether Turkey intended to or not, whether Turkey deserves to or not. The logic of Israeli security politics demanded a successor to Iran, and Turkey's behavior in Syria, its military expansion, its alliance building with Qatar and the Muslim Brotherhood, its open hostility toward Israel, made it the most credible candidate. Netanyahu, meanwhile, is doing something that gets less attention than the Bennett rhetoric, but is arguably more strategically significant. He is building what he calls a new alliance architecture, a hexagon: India, Greece, Cyprus, Arab Gulf states, a coalition explicitly designed, geographically, diplomatically, economically, to encircle Turkey. Think about that geometry for a moment. Greece and Cyprus, both historical rivals of Turkey, being actively courted as Israeli partners. India, which has its own strategic reasons for checking Turkish influence in Central Asia and the Muslim world, being brought into a framework with Israel for the first time in a serious way. Gulf states that were once deeply hostile to Israel, now signing normalization agreements, being included in a coalition that happens to be configured as a ring around Ankara. This is not accidental. This is deliberate strategic architecture. And it is being built right now, while Bennett is making speeches and Turkish analysts are warning about inevitable conflict. The real competition between Israel and Turkey is not military. It is not going to be settled by airstrikes. It is going to be settled by who builds the better coalition, who secures the better position in Syria, who gains the trust of the Arab world's next generation of leaders, and who manages Washington more effectively. And on that last point, managing Washington, both Israel and Turkey have real assets, real vulnerabilities, and a real contest underway that most Americans are not watching closely enough. So let's bring this home. Because everything I've laid out, the Bennett speech, the Syria competition, the NATO trap, the military reality, the strategic game behind the headlines, all of it converges on a set of practical questions that affect American interests directly. The most likely scenario is not war. I want to be clear about that. The most likely scenario is what military analysts call a Cold War within a hot region, proxy competition inside Syria, diplomatic maneuvering at the UN, at NATO summits, in Washington corridors, cyber operations because both Israel and Turkey have sophisticated cyber capabilities and both have demonstrated willingness to use them against adversaries, economic pressure, trade restrictions, energy leverage. This is the competition that is actually happening, and it will continue for years, regardless of what any politician says at any conference. The wild card is Erdogan. I want to spend a moment on this because I think it's genuinely important and genuinely underappreciated by American audiences. Erdogan has spent 20 years doing something that Western analysts consistently underestimate. He has repeatedly escalated beyond the point where rational strategic calculation suggested he would stop. He shot down a Russian fighter jet in 2015 when every analyst said he wouldn't dare. He sent Turkish military forces into Libya when everyone said he had nothing to gain. He bought Russian S-400s when everyone said the American pressure would stop him. He has a pattern, a deeply established, well-documented pattern, of moving further than his adversaries expected, and then managing the fallout. That pattern is what makes Turkey the genuinely unpredictable variable in this situation. Not Bennett's rhetoric, not Netanyahu's coalition building. Erdogan's willingness to do what the room says he won't. And the final question, the one that I think matters most for everyone watching this, is the American position. Because the United States is now in a situation where two of its most important regional partners are in active strategic competition, where that competition has a physical front line in Syria that is close enough for accidents, where the legal framework of NATO creates obligations that point in opposite directions, and where the domestic politics of both Israel and Turkey make de-escalation harder, not easier, as time goes on. What I can tell you, what history tells you, if you've been watching the Middle East since 1979, is this. The United States has never successfully stayed out of a major Middle East conflict once the shooting started. Not in Lebanon, not in the Gulf, not in Iraq, not in Syria the first time around, not in any of it. If the Cold War between Israel and Turkey turns hot, even accidentally, even in a limited way, even in a single incident in the Syrian desert, the pressure on Washington to take a side will be immediate, enormous, and probably irresistible. And there is no good side to take. That is the real story behind Bennett's words in Jerusalem last week. Not the headline, not the soundbite, not the hot take. The real story is that the Middle East is reorganizing itself around a new rivalry, in a space where American forces are present, in a framework where American treaty obligations point in contradictory directions. And Washington is not nearly as prepared for that situation as it needs to be. The Middle East is not holding its breath because it's afraid of what Bennett said. The Middle East is holding its breath because it knows what comes after someone says it out loud. Subscribe if you haven't already. Hit the notification bell, because this story is moving fast, and the next development, whatever it is, wherever it comes from, is going to demand exactly the kind of breakdown we did today. We'll be here when it happens. Thank you for watching.